So today, we're continuing the series, We're All in This Together, Ephesians. And we're looking at this letter to the Ephesians that's part of the New Testament. It was written sometime between 60 and 80 AD, 1900 years ago. And today, we're talking about, it's the Sunday after Valentine's Day. We're talking about the topic, how to stay together. And we're focusing on, yes, long-term relationships, marriage, long-term commitments. However, I hope you listen very closely because I sincerely mean this. I want everyone here to feel welcome in this church, always and today. 50%, a full half of the adults in America are not married. Were you aware of that? And so a church who excludes, and I think there are a lot of churches who do, a church who excludes people who are not married, kind of makes them feel less than, is committing a really foolish mistake. And I would like to think I'm too smart for that. And I would like to think that I love people, regardless of their station in life. I got married, or Hannah and I were married when I was 31, which is some people think is late, and some people wouldn't say that, but I spent the entire decade of my 20s single. And I know how churches can kind of, marginalize people who are single. I do not want to do that today. So my hope is that everything you hear actually is transferable to any close relationship in your life. Does that make sense? Not just a marriage, not just a long-term commitment. And so I think there's something here for everybody. And also what we're doing in this series is every week we want to learn some nugget for how to interpret the Bible. Because the letter to the Ephesians raises all kinds of questions that thinking people have about the Bible. And we say around here, questions and doubts are welcome, and thinking people can take the Bible seriously. And so we want to deal with, well, how do I make sense of this? How do I make sense of these books written at least 2,000 years ago? Mark Twain is credited with saying, it's not the things in the Bible I don't understand that trouble me. It's the things in the Bible I do understand that give me trouble. And so what we want to do in this series is look at some of those things and talk about them. So we're going to do that as well. This passage, a couple more disclaimers. This passage is about a traditional husband and wife relationship. There are many couples connected with one church who do not fit that mold. So I want you to know that you're included in that as well. And final disclaimer, the relationship advice industry is big business. How many of you know that? Self-help books, TV shows, of course, magazine articles, etc. And there is a lot of relationship advice out there that is not necessarily evidence-based, meaning it's not based on research. There is no requirement that the most popular, the new faddish relationship book has any kind of evidence-based research in it. It could just be like some idea that somebody thought up, and it can sell millions of copies. So what I don't want to do today is I don't want to contribute to that. I don't want to toss out, marriage and relationship advice that may or may not apply to you, and then somehow that could negatively impact your marriage. I've heard stories from people who read self-help books probably destroyed their marriage. You just have to be very careful. And I want you to know that your pastor knows that there are limitations to what can be accomplished in a sermon. Nobody said amen there. It's being nice, I guess. But there are limitations for what a sermon can do. If you are really struggling in your relationship, please hear me say this. I think the best thing you could do is to go see a professional counselor together. And I know that may not be the most exciting, sexy thing that a pastor could say in a church, because there are lots of pastors who kind of think they're Dr. Phil, and they want to be the great, wise dispatcher of marriage advice, whether they know what they're talking about or not. And I would just like to be a responsible pastor, and I hope you appreciate that, to be able to say to you, if you're really struggling, I would recommend some kind of counseling to you. And I do want to give you this list. I'll give you this much. This is an article that was published in Psychology Today, and it's written by Susan Krauss Whitbourne, PhD. She's a professor of psychology at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. And she cited a 40-year study from UCLA about what to look for in professional counseling for your relationship. So this is if you go see a marriage and family counselor, this is what to look for in that counseling relationship. Does that make sense? So you might want to write these down. They'll be on the screen. I'm just going to fly through them quickly. Number one, You want to look for a counselor who helps you change your view of the relationship. Somebody that would help you see your relationship in context and stop the blame game. And remember what you appreciate about each other and become more adaptive to your circumstances if you're in tough times and it's straining your relationship. Second, you want a counselor who can help you modify dysfunctional behavior, like blaming, dominating, threatening, abuse, withdrawing, using sex as a weapon, pitting the children against one another. You want to see a counselor who could help you not do those things. You want to see a counselor who could decrease emotional avoidance, avoiding conflict. And they can help you express your needs to one another in healthy ways that bring you closer together instead of pushing you apart. You want to see a counselor that helps you improve your communication skills. I asked my wife before, when I was getting ready for the sermon, I'm like, honey, what do you think, is some of the best marriage advice you could give? And she instantly said, communication. I'm like, is there something I need to know here? Like, am I not doing very well? It was like instant answer. We had to talk about it for a few minutes. But it was, that's so important, of course. You want to see a counselor who can help you improve communication. And finally, you want to see a counselor who can help promote your strengths together as a couple and help you see why you're better together than you are apart and help you enjoy those strengths and rewrite your story. How many of you realize that the way we view our relationships is not always reality? It's just our frame of reference. It's our framework, the glasses, the lenses that we look at our relationship through, and we believe the stories that we make up about our relationship, and they may not always be true. And a good counselor could help you to see your relationship in a new light, through new lenses, new framework, however you want to put it, to see your story a little bit differently, that's more positive and would bring you closer together. So if you're experiencing trouble, you could see a counselor, and you would want to look for a counselor who can help you do these things. What we're going to do today is look at the big picture. Look at the big picture from Ephesians about how we can make a long-term relationship work. And that's why I say there are lots of details that we won't be able to cover in a sermon, but you could at least say, how are we doing here? In this list of the big picture items, how are we doing here? And that might help to spur some conversations and help you to grow closer together. So at the same time, this passage contains some views that are difficult to reconcile with the 21st century developed world. By developed world, I mean the United States and Europe and Canada and Brazil and Australia and Japan and Korea, South Korea. And when people value reason and evidence, there are some things, and equal rights and justice, there are some things that we're going to read in this passage that might cause you to kind of have an emotional reaction. And that's okay, because we're going to deal with those things. This is the infamous submit passage, if you've heard about that. It comes from Ephesians chapter 5, verses 21 through 33. So let's read it together. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands, as you do to the Lord. We'll talk about that. For the emotion was ratcheting up right there after the second line. Verse 23, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. We'll talk about that too. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. I love how uncomfortable it is when I read verses like this in this church. Verse 25, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body, just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. He's quoting Genesis chapter 1 there. This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. We have some work to do, don't we? I have my work cut out for me, don't I, today? So here's what we're going to do. We're going to deal with the parts of this passage that are difficult to reconcile with the 21st century developed world view. And then we're going to break down, well, what can we take from this passage that actually might be surprisingly relevant to our relationships in a way that could help us to grow closer together and make this relationship work in a way that maybe we don't even think is possible. So that's where we're headed today. Obviously, parts of this passage sound pretty palatable. The husbands, love your wife as Christ loved the church. That sounds pretty good, right? That sounds good, everybody. Submit yourselves to one another. That sounds pretty good. But then there are parts of this passage that fly in the face of a 21st century developed world understanding of women's rights and how a relationship should function with equality. And next week, we're going to read Ephesians 6:5, where the author says, slaves, obey your masters as though you're obeying Christ. If you meet somebody in Arizona who has escaped a human smuggler who's been enslaving them, my guess is you're not going to quote Ephesians 6:5 to them. Hey, well, Ephesians 6:5 says you should go back to your master. I'm calling the police. I doubt that's going to happen. So there are all kinds of questions raised in a passage like this that we need to deal with. And people who want to follow Jesus and be thinking people and take the Bible seriously read things like this, and it creates this cognitive dissonance. How am I supposed to take the Bible seriously when it says things that, they just get in my gut? How can I make sense of this? Well, the first week of this series, what was the lesson we learned about interpreting the Bible? Anybody remember? One person remembers. Nice. Matt gets a sticker after the service. Mind the gap. And what we meant by that was there's an enormous cultural gap between our culture now and the cultures that produce the biblical books. We have to take that into account. We can't just flop a Bible open and read it and say, okay, I'll do that now. You'll find yourself doing some pretty wild things if you took that approach. So mind the gap. Last week we talked about how the Bible is a library. It's a collection of books. The Protestant Bible has 66 books. Somebody said to me, hey, Ryan, that's a really good metaphor for understanding the Bible. And I'm like, it's not a metaphor. It's literally the case. The Bible is literally a library. We have it bound between two covers now, but if we just arrange the books of the Bible like we're used to, it would be a bookshelf with books. And so we don't expect every book you pull off the bookshelf to agree with all the other books. The conversations that are preserved in the Bible aren't there because they all agree with each other. They're there because they're important. And they lead to the conversation and push it forward. We're going to see that here in a minute. So today, what we're talking about, the little takeaway for interpreting the Bible, is the Bible moves. If you're keeping notes in your worship handout, the Bible moves. In the ancient Middle East and the Greco-Roman world, where the biblical books were written, Greco-Roman meaning Greeks and Romans, the time of the Roman Empire, 2,000 years ago, women were viewed as inferior to men. That's a fact of history that many of us are already aware of. All of society was organized around benefiting older men. And because of that, they were called patriarchal societies. In the New Testament, there are 4 examples of what are called Greco-Roman household codes. And a household code was a way of explaining the values of the culture, the social norm. It's a way of saying this is what's normal here. And there are 4 of them in the New Testament, and this is one of them that we just read. It's part of one of them that we just read, and we're going to look at the rest of it next week. These household codes, these societal norms, expressed how society should be organized with the goal of benefiting the patriarch. All of society was organized in a way that benefited this man. And the more academic word would be called the paterfamilias. Pater is father, familias family, the father of the family. All of society benefited that guy. So in the New Testament, when you read any household code, you see wives and children and slaves. All of them are oriented towards benefiting the paterfamilias. Point made? And that's true here as well. Roman values included honor, courage, power, glory. Russell Crowe. Think of Gladiator. Those are the values. It's an honor and shame society. And the last thing you want to do is bring shame on the paterfamilias. That could actually be a deadly mistake, to bring shame to the paterfamilias. Children feared their fathers. Why? Because a father could beat his children, and often did. There would be no legal consequence for that. Wives could fear their husbands because she did not have the rights that he had. This is the culture behind what we just read. Marriage in the times of the New Testament was an arranged marriage between a 20-something man and a teenage girl. Princeton did a study that found that this one area, the median age for the groom was 23, the median age for the bride was 15. And the marriage was arranged by their parents. It was not romantic. It was a business transaction. A dowry by the family of the bride to the groom to cover the expenses. And it was viewed in this way that the 15-year-old was under the protection of her father, and then she was transferred to be under the protection of her husband. That's how marriage worked in Roman times. The Romans preferred monogamy over the norm in the Middle East, which was polygamy. And in the Roman law, a woman could divorce her husband. In Jewish law, one could not divorce her husband. But still, the husband had many more rights in the Roman world than the wife did. Now, one more thing. During the first century, when the books of the Bible were written, there was kind of a women's lib movement going on. There was this awakening that women don't have the rights that they didn't have the rights that they wanted, and women were gaining power and freedom. And how did the patriarchal culture respond to this? Did they love that? Did they embrace it and fight for the rights of women? No. Obviously, they resisted. Any encroachment on the power of the patriarch, of the paterfamilias, was seen as a threat to the entire order of society. And remember, if you were here on week 1, the area where Ephesus was, in what is now southwest Turkey, was a center for Artemis worship. Artemis, she was a virginal goddess of hunting in the wilderness and childbirth. We have a statue of Artemis, I think. Do you see those many round objects near her chest? There's been a debate in archaeology and religion about what those are. We have a great children's ministry. I give that as a hint about where we're about to go. There's the debate that perhaps those are many breasts, and it would portray her extreme femininity, her girl power, in a sense. Now, it's more popular recently to think that what she's holding there next to her chest are bull testicles, which is exactly what you expected me to say, correct? And what we're finding out is the worship of Artemis included sacrificing bulls and then throwing the testicles of the bulls to an altar and making a pile of them sacrificed to Artemis. That is some serious girl power right there. And the worship of Artemis, that was seen as threatening to the society of the Roman world. And it was like, it caught on like wildfire. Artemis was very popular. And so it was threatening. Now, in the culture of the New Testament, Christians were a small minority group. They were afraid, like we talked about last week, they were afraid of persecution. And these household codes in the New Testament are a way of saying to the patriarchs of the culture, Christians are not trying to subvert the Roman Empire. Some Christians have a hard time with that, thinking that there may have been political motivations behind the authorship of Scripture. Human beings are human beings. And I accept by faith that somehow God is involved in the authorship of Scripture and somehow God speaks through it. But it helps, if you're a small, scared, fledgling movement, to assure the patriarchal leaders, well, we're not going to overturn everything here, because that was feared by the patriarchal leaders. Now, at the same time, the author of Ephesians does something remarkable in the passage we just read. And this is what I mean by the Bible moves. Ephesians actually limits the authority of the paterfamilias, the patriarch. And the part that we read, actually the longest section of that passage, is the part that says, husbands, love your wives. Treat her like you treat your own body. You remember reading that? That wasn't in the typical Greek household code. That wasn't normal. It wasn't normal to say to the paterfamilias who could beat his wife and children with no consequence. It wasn't normal to say to him, you know what? You should treat her like you treat yourself. You should love her as Jesus loved the church and gave himself for her. And this phrase in verse 21, submit yourselves to one another. I was like, what? And so here's how it works in Bible interpretation to understand that the Bible moves. I have a line, a graph here, which I absolutely love. Charts of any kind really thrill me. It was supposed to be funny, and it wasn't. That's fine. I'm okay with that, all right? I'm okay up here. So on the far left, we have Middle Eastern and Greco-Roman culture. Household codes, benefits to paterfamilias. Just to the right of that, we have the culture within the biblical books. So not only do we have household codes, but we have the power of the paterfamilias being limited. Wow. That's actually a step forward from the Greco-Roman culture in which the Bible was written. And then on the far right, we have our culture in the 21st century developed world. Now, when we read a passage like we just read, we're reading back here into the culture of the biblical books, and we read things like, the husband is like Jesus to the wife. And the husband is the head of the wife, which means authority figure. And we're thinking, oh, my word. Like, for us, that is a step backward, correct? Right? Most of us are sure of that. That's a step backward for us, correct? However, in its time, it was actually a move forward. Do you see how it works? That's what I mean by the Bible moves. The Bible moved, and you see this over and over and over again in the Old Testaments and in the Old Testament and New Testament. The Bible moved its own culture in the direction of human dignity and human flourishing. Moved it in the direction of dignity and flourishing. Looking back on many parts of the Bible, I hope this is actually a massive aha for some of us here. Looking back at many parts of the Bible, we think, man, that's like even barbaric. That's like it's just such a step backward. If I actually literally did that, I would be undoing all social progress made in the United States. But does it help to realize that at the time, the biblical books actually moved their cultures forward? Ephesians, check this out, Ephesians teaches a socially progressive view of women for its time. Is that a light bulb for anybody? It's like, wow. Now, how many Christians in America right now have a socially progressive view of women's rights? Isn't that interesting? Lots of Christians in America want to enshrine this for all time and leave the Bible there. Leave the Bible in 20 centuries ago, 19 centuries ago, and whatever it says, which are actually, it's a Middle Eastern and Greco-Roman view of women, well, that's God's all-time truth about women then. They want to leave the Bible there, even though we're here. I hope the music works later, I'm sorry about that. They want to leave the Bible here. So another thing we mean by the Bible moves is the Bible's not here anymore. We're here, and we're reading it today. And we're able to look back and see how the Bible interacted with its own culture, but the way that we interpret it changes as well. And what I just said there would just be absolute heresy to the way that some of you were raised. That the Bible moves, and the way we interpret it moves over time. Does that make sense? And what we see is, and I would say by faith, that God is somehow working, or God was somehow working in these cultures, pushing them forward in the direction of dignity and what is good for humanity and flourishing. And oh, how often now, people who claim, and they love the Bible, they don't push society forward in the direction of human dignity and human flourishing. They actually want to push it backward. They're reactionary. They want to push it backward and enshrine for all time ancient Middle Eastern and Greco-Roman values. Point made? The Bible moves. I hope for some of you that opens up a whole new door for interpreting the Bible and being able to take the Bible seriously. So the next question is, well, then how do we interpret it? What can it mean to us? If there are cultural influences in the Bible, and even though it moved forward, it's still kind of a step back for us, how do we interpret it? Well, if you're keeping notes, when it comes to making relationships work, whether it's a marriage or a long-term commitment or it's your best friend, I would encourage you to apply the passage to both people in the relationship. Verse 21 tells us, submit yourselves to one another. That was a move forward. That was not a part of a Greco-Roman household code. Submit yourselves to one another. I would say to practice egalitarian mutual submission. Egalitarian means equal. So instead of viewing women as inferior, as women were viewed in the Greco-Roman world, we view men and women as equals, and you can practice mutual submission. One of the important words in this passage is submit. In Greek, it's hupotasso, and it's a military term. It means to fall in line under the authority. Now, it's easy to see why that was popular in the Greco-Roman world, but what if it looked like this? Let's just take my relationship with my wife as an example. What if, instead of my wife just submitting to me, what if we obey verse 21 and we submit to one another? What might that look like in our relationship? And I'm getting really uncomfortable because she probably does a better job of it than I do. But it would look like asking, what's best for this person I love? Not just what I want, not how I can get what I want, but what's really best? And you know what? I'm going to be really honest. There are times when I realize, man, my wife's doing a lot of work around here, and I feel like I should help her out. But it benefits me. And so there's like this selfish gene I have to fight against. And intentionally ask the question, what would it look like for me to practice mutual submission too in my relationship with my wife? To where the two of us are mutually submitting to each other. Can you imagine how a relationship would work if both people are thinking, how could I put the other's needs ahead of my own? Does that sound like a pretty good plan? Nobody's nodding. Does that sound like a pretty good plan? We want to stay together, right, you guys? Okay. What if I'm putting the other person's needs ahead of my own? And both do that. And both are intentionally asking that question. And sometimes both can remind each other to intentionally ask that question. I want to put my needs or your needs ahead of mine, and how would that look? And then the other one's like, okay, hint, hint. All right, I want to put your needs ahead of mine. What would mutual submission look like in your relationship? And I think a part of that is, what happens when things get heated? What happens when you conflicts and the discussions, we'll say, that over time really can create separation. And the relationships breaking apart, it starts somewhere. And often that is with words that we wish we could take back, or things that were just as unhealthy, things we talked about earlier. Well, what might that look like to be able to submit to one another in an instance like that? Well, Brandon is going to be leading our Nicaragua mission trip in the meeting later. Brandon's career involves the study of human behavior and the human brain. And he shared something with me a couple weeks ago that I just think is fascinating, and it's incredibly, this could save a relationship. He said, what happens when you get into a heated argument, we hear something that affects us emotionally, and all of a sudden our brain comes under the control of the amygdala. Who has heard of the amygdala before? The amygdala is like this almond-shaped little tiny thing in our brain. It's basically the reptilian parts of our brain. It activates fight or flight. It's what controls our emotions. A lot of memory is connected to that, strong memories. And when we get into a heated discussion, we'll say, the amygdala takes over. And all of a sudden, we're just flooded. Have you experienced this? We're emotionally flooded. And that's when we're at risk of saying things that we don't really mean. Or even if we do kind of mean them, we wouldn't say them like that. And an incredible damage can be done that looks like it's like anything but submitting to each other. And check this out. Here's what Brandon taught me about how to snap your brain out of amygdala mode and be able to think again. He said, here's what you do. You obviously have to catch it before you go too far down the road. Let's say you're standing in the living room and you're arguing. He said, what you do is you focus on anything in the room and you make an observation about that. So let's say that you have picture frames on the wall. Okay, I see a picture frame. That's a rectangle. Like the argument's happening. You feel yourself getting worked up and you're like, that's a rectangle. I see rectangles have four sides. That frame is brown. It's kind of an antique patina looking on that frame. That picture was taken in 2005. And in making observations, you snap your brain out of amygdala mode back into like frontal lobe mode, where you can think logically. And if you don't do that, you're just going down the amygdala route farther and farther and farther. And that's when things happen that we regret. So just make a little observation and start there. So trivial example, I was in line at the grocery store this past week. I wanted to test it out. And I was kind of getting agitated because this person had a full cart of groceries and then, realized once all the groceries were bagged, I have to pay for those groceries. And so now we're going to take a long time writing out a check. Am I the only person agitated by things like, I'm a bad pastor, apparently, for being agitated by that. So the person's writing out the check very slowly and double checking everything. I'm thinking, oh, come on. I have places to be, and so I'm starting to get agitated. What I did was I started looking for squares in the line. And so, that chewing gum package, there's a square. Squares have 4 sides, equal sides. There's a square on that chewing gum package. Oh, that tabloid about Kim Kardashian's weight, there's a square there. Oh, there's an imitation tap light from the TV infomercials. On that box, there's a square right there. And then something. There's a square. It worked. I could feel myself. Oh, you know what? Everybody's busy. The person forgot. Maybe it's just their habit. It's okay. I'm going to be able to get to my responsibilities. That's a trivial example, obviously. That's a lot different than being in a heated argument with somebody you love. But hey, it's pretty valuable information, right? Focus on something. Make observations and snap your brain out of the amygdala mode. It's a way that you could submit mutually to one another in an egalitarian way. B, if you're keeping notes, play to each other's strengths. The Greek historian Plutarch lived during the time that the New Testament books were written. And he describes husbands as benevolent dictators, hopefully benevolent. And he wrote a letter to a couple he knew who were getting married in about 90 or 100 AD. It's called Advice to a Bride and Groom. It was a wedding gift to them. And here's how he explained the husband-wife relationship. He explains that the husband's leadership is crucial. The husband is the one who displays the leadership. The Greek word is hegemonia, as in hegemony, ruler, and decision-making in the home. So the husband leads and makes decisions. He uses some words that are quite stronger. The husband is to rule his wife, as a king would rule subjects. Plutarch states that a wife should be sweet. The Greek word there is glucose. A wife should be sweet and agreeable regarding sexual relations with her husband, but she should never initiate. According to Plutarch, a wife who initiates with her husband is acting like a mistress, and a good wife must never behave like a mistress. So the guys are like, Plutarch just needs to shut up right now. I don't care what Plutarch says. That was the typical Greco-Roman view of leadership in the home. That's how it worked. Another important word in this passage is the word head in the passage, that the husband is the head of the wife. It means authority. It's kephael. It means authority, general, Caesar, ruler. And in Plutarch's world, that was the husband. Now, in any relationship where you have two people, one of them is probably going to be the more natural leader. Would you agree? And both people in the relationship might be comfortable with that, actually. That may have been what brought them together. One will probably be the more natural leader. And so if the husband is the more, if you're a husband and a wife and you're married, and if the husband is the more natural leader, well, then this passage, I guess, works for you. If the wife's okay with that. If you both consent to that, then, hey, there you go. I guess it is as easy as reading the words off the page. But what happens is, it's really interesting in evangelical churches, when you can tell, if you have a husband and a wife, and you can tell that the wife is actually the more natural leader. Have you met couples like that? In the evangelical world, like, the church just doesn't know what to do with that. Like, those couples don't exist. Because there are plenty of times, I can think of two of my friends right off the bat, whose wives are just more natural leaders than they are. And that is when things get interesting in churches that want to apply everything in these passages literally. It just doesn't work like that. No matter how much they fake it, no matter how much the guy puffs his chest out, he probably likes it too. It's probably part of what attracted him to his wife, that she was a leader in ways that he wasn't. And that works for them. But it's not literally how this passage goes, but they can still play to each other's strengths. Not only do you have a more natural leader, but you also have areas where both of you are going to have leadership abilities in different areas, correct? And if this person is more of a leader in areas of organization, maybe this person is the more natural leader, but they're going to defer to this person's leadership because they're just more organized, right? And there are going to be times when the natural leader, does things. There are going to be times when the other person leads. And I think of it kind of like in a football game. You have the coach who you hope is a natural leader, but then the coach also has a defensive coordinator and an offensive coordinator. And some teams, the quarterbacks call plays. And so even though you might have a more natural leader in the relationship, there are leadership responsibilities that are shared according to the person's strengths. What would that look like for you? If you're keeping notes, here's some questions for you. Maybe you could discuss these. In your relationship, who is the natural leader? Let's just name it. Who is that person? Second question, are you both comfortable with that? How's that working for you, Dr. Phil? And then talk about how that plays out in your relationship. Well, there are times when I think that maybe you're too domineering. Or there are times when I think maybe you should step up a little bit. Oh, you felt that? I didn't know you felt that way. Okay, well. And maybe you could work out a new normal and how you can play to each other's strengths, regardless of who the natural leader is. Another question would be, what are the strengths each of you have? And what are you better at? What are you better at? And even if the person is not the natural leader, they can still lead in certain areas. So play to your strengths. I think this passage tells us that. And then lastly, commit to self-giving love. We live in a culture where about 50% of marriages end in divorce. As a pastor, I carry a weight for couples in the church because I know that life pulls at us in ways that we don't always expect. And I know that people walk into a church service on a Sunday morning and they're smiling, good morning, how you doing? And I know that often behind that is hidden a tremendous amount of pain and conflict and trying to negotiate relationships and make them work. If it's not marriage, it can be close family relationship, close friendships, work relationships. And I know there are people who carry a tremendous amount of pain and really secrecy. I just know that as a pastor. And so I carry this weight for couples and want to do everything I can to be supportive. That's why I say, if you're really struggling, go to a professional counselor. If you want to email me, I can refer you to somebody. There's no shame in that. Here's the point that I'm making. If you're struggling, if you're not sure that you can make your relationship work, if you have doubts, if you fall out of love, if you're not sure that you want to be with that person anymore, do you know what that makes you? Normal. That makes you normal. There's so many couples who don't realize that because they don't share their struggles. They don't know what makes them normal. And you're not going to say anything to shock me. I can guarantee you that. But we could find help and save relationships before they're pulled apart. And this last point is huge. And it's actually easier to interpret out of this passage, even though it's 19 centuries ago, because it just makes sense in a relationship. Let's read it again, verse 25. Husbands, love your wives. And I think you could just put wives in there too. Husbands, love your wives. Husbands or wives, love your husbands. If you're in a same-sex relationship, you love the other person the way that you love yourself. As Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, you love the other person as Jesus loves you. Whoa. That's self-giving love, isn't it? To make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and present her to himself as a radiant church. Verse 28, in the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. The way that you love your partner is the way that you love yourself. Wow. Is that that's not the understanding of long-term relationships that a lot of people have in our culture. We're just, this person makes me feel good, so I'll hang in there for a while. But the writer says, you love your partner the way you love yourself and the way that Christ loves the church, the whole new level. Verse 31, for this reason, we're talking about a man and woman here, but a man will leave his father and mother and be united, and the two will become one flesh. In marriage, in God's eyes, two people become one. You're a team together. What hurts one of you hurts the other one because you're one. You're no longer two. It's not about what can I get out of this relationship anymore, but it's about what can I give? We're together here. How I treat my spouse is the way I treat me. It's self-giving love. Again, what if both partners treated each other in this way? And I just wonder, there's a place in your worship. Would everybody open this up in your worship handout? It's actually on the card, the Connect card. It says Next Steps. See that blue box? It says Next Steps. That top question is kind of based on what Brandon was sharing too about goal setting and setting small goals. That's a different story. But what one act of mutual submissions and self-giving love, putting the other's needs ahead of your own, could you try in your relationship this week? If you're struggling, if things are dull, if they're stale, if you're not sure how this is going to work, what one act of mutual submission and self-giving love could you commit to this week? Just one thing this week that could maybe just kind of break the habits and maybe create a new future for your relationship. Some of you may not be sure there's a future for your relationship. What one thing could you do this week that would be an act of self-giving love, of mutual submission, that could maybe give a whole new future to your relationship? And I'll close with this. A few days after my wife and I returned from our honeymoon, this very memorable thing happened. More memorable for me, I think. We had Valentine's Day dinner this past Friday, and we were reminiscing and talking about this, and my wife didn't quite remember exactly when this happened, but I remember the day and the time, because it's something that affected her, and I think it was more of a traumatic experience for me, because I saw her hurting, and it was just burned into my memory. We got back from our honeymoon on a Sunday, and this happened on a Thursday morning. I was getting ready for work, and it's probably about 10 minutes away from leaving the house. And I tell this story with my wife's permission, just so you know. And she used to have asthma, really doesn't anymore, but we had inhalers and strategically placed around the house. And it's just part of who I am. Just put the inhalers around, plan in advance. And I was in the bathroom getting ready to leave, and my wife, just a few days, walked into the bathroom mouthing, "I can't breathe." Now, a few days after a honeymoon. So I just went into probably amygdala mode. I grabbed an inhaler, threw it on the counter next to her. I ran back into the room where my phone was, picked it up, called 911, freaking out, and telling the dispatcher my wife can't breathe. And while I was on the phone, thankfully, I heard this choking noise. And I heard her say, "I can breathe." Jeez. The ambulance still came, and she was able to get enough air that she was okay. And we went to the ER and discovered, and again, I tell this with her permission, it was the birth control medication that she was on. That apparently a side effect of that was it can close vocal cords, which is a really important side effect to be aware of. And so I was just an absolute mess. And when we went back home, that night, I was so freaked out that we put pillows and blankets in the car, and I drove my wife to the hospital parking lot, and we slept in the car in the hospital parking lot, outside of the ER. That gives you more insight into my personality, okay? But I'm thinking, if this happens again, what if the ambulance can't get there on time, And so my wife's like, was it a month after we got married? Or I'm like, no, I know the day and the time when this traumatic experience happened. Now, while I would never have obviously wished that on anybody to go through an experience like that, and she's went off that medication, hasn't had anything like that since, and she's in great health. Applause for my wife. That's right. I like it. While I would never wish that on anybody, of course, you know what? It was actually a fantastic way to start a marriage, because it burned into my brain this traumatic experience that taught me not to take my wife for granted. You know what I mean? That you just never know. In the world we live in, you just never know. And when it comes to something like, relationship struggles and time goes on and you get used to the person, you have these discussions and arguments and things like, practice mutual submission and self-giving love and play to each other's strengths. In the back of my mind, where it really gets me in the gut is, I know what it was like to think, oh my goodness, am I going to lose my wife? I know for a few seconds what that feels like. And it was actually a fantastic way to begin a marriage. The people that we have around us are so much more important to us than we realize. Because over time, we just tend to take them for granted. And so realizing, oh my goodness, what if this person were not in my life? And thinking through that, and oh man, this is what I'm thankful about this. Oh man, we have it so great in so many ways. Even if we have problems, we have it so great in so many ways. I want to practice mutual submission. I want to play to our strengths. I want to commit to self-giving love, and I want to make this thing work. We want to stay together. We want to do everything we possibly can. I don't condemn people who have tried everything, and it didn't work. I don't condemn them. But for those who are struggling, we won't always have those people. We don't know. And will we commit to self-giving love and submitting and playing to each other's strengths and stay together? Okay.